for the law has said to her in the plainest possible English, 'My charming friend, I have no terrors for you.'" "How was she pardoned?" asked Mr. Bashwood, breathlessly. "They told me at the time, but I have forgotten. Was it the Home Secretary? If it was, I respect the Home Secretary. I say, the Home Secretary was deserving of his place." "Quite right, old gentleman," rejoined Bashwood the younger. "The Home Secretary was the obedient humble servant of an enlightened free press, and he was deserving of his place. Is it possible you don't know how she cheated the gallows? If you don't, I must tell you. On the evening of the trial, two or three of the young buccaneers of literature went down to two or three newspaper offices, and wrote two or three heart-rending leading articles on the subject of the proceedings in court. The next morning the public caught light like tinder, and the prisoner was tried over again, before an amateur court of justice, in the columns of the newspapers. All the people who had no personal experience whatever on the subject seized their pens, and rushed, by kind permission of the editor, into print. Doctors who had not attended the sick man, and who had not been present at the examination of the body, declared by dozens that he had died a natural death. Barristers, without business, who had not heard the evidence, attacked the jury who had heard it, and judged the judge, who had sat on the bench before some of them were born. The general public followed the lead of the barristers and the doctors, and the young buccaneers who had set the thing going. Here was the law that they all paid to protect them actually doing its duty in dreadful earnest. Shocking! Shocking! The British public rose to protest as one man against the working of its own machinery, and the Home Secretary, in a state of distraction, went to the judge. The judge held firm. He had said it was the right verdict at the time, and he said so still. "But suppose," says the Home Secretary, "that the prosecution had tried some other way of proving her guilty at the trial than the way they did. What would you and the jury have done then?" Of course it was quite impossible for the judge to say. This comforted the Home Secretary, to begin with, and, when he got the judge's consent after that to having the conflict of medical evidence submitted to one great doctor, and when the one great doctor took the merciful view, after expressly stating in the first instance that he knew nothing practically of the merits of the case, the Home Secretary was perfectly satisfied. The prisoner's death warrant went into the waste paper basket. The verdict of the law was reversed by general acclamation, and the verdict of the newspapers carried the day. But the best of it is to come. You know what happened when the people found themselves, with the pet object of their sympathy, suddenly cast loose on their hands? A general impression prevailed directly that she was not quite innocent enough, after all, to be let out of prison then and there. Punish her a little, that was the state of the popular feeling. Punish her a little, Mr. Home Secretary, on general moral grounds. A small course of gentle legal medicine, if you love us, and then we shall feel perfectly easy on the subject to the end of our days." "Don't joke about it," cried his father. "Don't, Jemmy. Didn't they try her again? They couldn't. They dursn't. Nobody can be tried twice over for the same offense." "Pooh, pooh! She could be tried a second time for a second offense," retorted Bashwood the younger, "and tried she was. Luckily for the pacification of the public mind, she had rushed headlong into redressing her own grievances, as women will, when she discovered that her husband had cut her down from a legacy of £50,000 to a legacy of 5,000 by a stroke of his pen. The day before the inquest a locked drawer in Mr. Waldron's dressing-room table, which contained some valuable jewellery, was discovered to have been opened and emptied, and when the prisoner was committed by the magistrates, the precious stones were found torn out of their settings and sewed up in her stays. The lady considered it a case of justifiable self-compensation. The law declared it to be a robbery, committed on the executors of the dead man. The lighter offense which had been passed over when such a charge as murder was brought against her, was just the thing to revive, to save appearances in the eyes of the public. They had stopped the course of justice, in the case of the prisoner, at one trial, and now all they wanted was to set the course of justice going again, in the case of the prisoner, at another. She was arraigned for the robbery, after having been pardoned for the murder; and, what is more, if her beauty and her misfortunes hadn't made a strong impression on her lawyer, she would not only have had to stand another trial, but would have had even the £5,000 to which she was entitled by the second will taken away from her as a felon by the Crown. "I respect her lawyer, I admire her lawyer," exclaimed Mr. Bashwood. "I should like to take his hand and tell him so." "He wouldn't thank you if you did," remarked Bashwood the younger. "He is under a comfortable impression that nobody knows how he saved Mrs. Waldron's legacy for her but himself." "I beg your pardon, Jemmy," interposed his father, "but don't call her Mrs. Waldron. Speak of her, please, by her name when she was innocent and young and a girl at school. Would you mind, for my sake, calling her Miss Gwilt?" "Not I. It makes no difference to me what name I give her." "Bother your sentiment. Let's go on with the facts. This is what the lawyer did before the second trial came off. He told her she would be found guilty again, to a dead certainty, and this time, he said, the public will let the law take its course. Have you got an old friend whom you can trust?" She hadn't such a thing as an old friend in the world. "Very well, then," says the lawyer, "you must trust me. Sign this paper, and you will have executed a fictitious sale of all your property to myself. When the right time comes, I shall first carefully settle with your husband's executors, and I shall then reconvey the money to you, securing it properly, in case you ever marry again, in your own possession. The Crown in other transactions of this kind frequently waives its rights of disputing the validity of the sale, and if the Crown is no harder on you than on other people, when you come out of prison you will have your £5,000 to begin the world with again. Need of the lawyer, when she was going to be tried for robbing the executors, to put her up to a way of robbing the Crown, wasn't it? Ah, what a world it is!" The last effort of the son's sarcasm passed unheeded by the father. "In prison," he said to himself. "Oh me! After all that misery, in prison again!" "Yes," said Bashwood the younger, rising and stretching himself, "that's how it ended. The verdict was guilty, and the sentence was imprisonment for 2 years. She served her time, and came out, as well as I can reckon it, about 3 years since. If you want to know what she did when she recovered her liberty, and how she went on afterward, I may be able to tell you something about it, say, on another occasion, when you have got an extra note or two in your pocket-book. For the present, all you need know, you do know. There isn't the shadow of doubt that this fascinating lady has the double slur on her of having been found guilty of murder, and of having served her term of imprisonment for theft. There's your money's worth for your money, with the whole of my wonderful knack at stating a case clearly, thrown in for nothing. If you have any gratitude in you, you ought to do something handsome, one of these days, for your son. But for me, I'll tell you what you would have done, old gentleman. If you could have had your own way, you would have married Miss Gwilt." Mr. Bashwood rose to his feet, and looked at his son steadily in the face. "If I could have my own way," he said, "I would marry her now." Bashwood the younger started back a step. "After all I have told you?" he asked in the blankest astonishment. "After all you have told me." "With the chance of being poisoned, the first time you happen to offend her?" "With the chance of being poisoned," answered Mr. Bashwood, "in 24 hours." The spy of the Private Inquiry Office dropped back into his chair, cowed by his father's words and his father's looks. "Mad," he said to himself, "stark mad, by Jingo!" Mr. Bashwood looked at his watch, and hurriedly took his hat from a side table. "I should like to hear the rest of it," he said. "I should like to hear every word you have to tell me about her, to the very last. But the dreadful galloping time is getting on. For all I know, they may be on their way to be married at this very moment." "What are you going to do?" asked Bashwood the younger, getting between his father and the door. "I'm going to the hotel," said the old man, trying to pass him. "I'm going to see Mr. Armadale." What for?